right, we are at 11:20. Thank you so much for your patience, Dan. I don't know that anyone's going to join us today, so I'll just go ahead and get started. Um, Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining once again for another Lunch and Learn series. Today, we are very fortunate to have Professor Dan Meyer joining us. Dan Meyer has been a member of our faculty since sometime in the last century. He has taught policy, research, and macro practice. His research conducted through the Institute of Research on Poverty focuses on policies that address the economic well-being of single-parent families. He enjoys playing with his grandchildren, international travel, Ted Lasso, and ultimate frisbee. So from here, I'll just let Dan take the floor and you go ahead with the presentation for today.
So thank you, Latoya. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides. And did that work?
Yes, it did.
Excellent. So my talk today is on global perspectives on family policy. My next slide. Okay, here's the plan for what I'm going to do today. I've organized this as a series of questions. We're going to start with what's family policy. We're going to talk about whether countries have the same approach to family policy, how approaches have been categorized. We're going to end up using a particular approach by Walter Korpi that divides countries into having an earner-carer model, or a traditional family model, or a market-oriented model. And then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about child support, so money from one parent to another when families separate. So we're going to think about how that might fit into family policy by looking at what would happen when children live in a traditional situation, which is mostly with their mother, and then what happens in an emerging situation, which is where kids spend half their time with both parents. Then we're going to talk about whether our predictions about how child support fit into those categories are actually realized. Does it work? And then a little bit of time on what this means for us. All within 45 to 60 minutes. Okay, so we'll start with this red quote. You'll see this slide a lot with red text showing you where we are. So what's family policy? So classic definition from a long time ago is everything that government does to and for the family. That's a very broad definition and covers many things. So a more typical approach has been to look at policies that are aimed at the family. So not the ones that government does to and for families, but the ones particularly targeted at families. And so here, the three main things that we're going to talk about are child allowances or child benefits. This might be in cash or in tax credits. So if in the US scheme, you've heard a lot of talk in the last several months about the child tax credit. That's what we mean. Money for a child to help parents raise a child. Now, another typical policy then is family leave. So what happens when somebody has a child? Does their work have to give them leave? And is that leave paid? Is that leave paid by the government or by the employer? So is that only for mothers or only for fathers or for either parent? So those are the kinds of policies we're going to think about there. Then there's a whole cluster of policies dealing mostly with childcare, but also with early childhood education. So I'm going to abbreviate that as the literature does as ECEC, so early childhood education and care. And then sometimes other policies are included, things that promote mothers' work, things that might promote fertility, ways that elders are cared for and how that's supported within the family. And then maybe child support. So we're going to see how child support might fit into these sorts of policies. But before we do that, let's just think about whether countries have the same approach to family policy or whether there's differences. Here's a little map of maternity leave around the world. You might be able to see that the red countries, there are two, have no paid leave. That's the US and Papua New Guinea. And then you see the other colors show more and more leave. The dark blue being the countries that have the most paid maternity leave. So substantial amount of variation around the globe. Here's paternity leave. Here the totals are less, right? So whereas in the last slide, 52 weeks was the top category. Here it's 14 weeks or more. And now there's more countries in the no paid leave category. In fact, some of these countries have 3 buckets: a bucket for maternity leave, so leave that mothers can take after a birth; paternity leave, leave that fathers can take after a birth; and then another bucket of leave that either parent could take. Now, we could talk about that and what these policies do for gender equality, and there's a whole literature on this. I hope that by saying that, you're intrigued, and we'll look at that more, but we're not going to talk about either of those today. And we're not going to talk about early childhood education and care, but it turns out countries do substantially different things here too. So if we look at the OECD countries and gather data on public expenditures in early childhood education and care per child aged 0 to 5, there's huge differences. Luxembourg, Iceland, Norway all spend more than 12,000 per kid. This is government expenditures. The average across countries is 5,200. Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Turkey all spend under 2,000. The US spends about 4,000. So the US on the low side, the US with no leave, but some countries who do substantially more in supporting families. So we see this variation around the globe, and that has led some to say, well, let's think every country doesn't do necessarily a unique thing. There's some general patterns. How could we categorize countries' approaches to family policy? Right, we're working with an important model in the field by Walter Korpi and colleagues. He starts by saying there's 2 dimensions of support for families that we could think about. One of them is dual earner support. So these are, this is an array of policies that are intended to help both mothers and fathers earn. So the notion here is this is not a traditional family, which we'll come to later, where one person, usually the husband, works and the other person, usually the wife, does not. This is intended to be gender neutral and also to be a description of policies in most of these countries that are not just for different sex couples, but also for same-sex couples. So the idea here is a country trying to get both parents to work and facilitate that work. And so you'd want accessible childcare, and you'd want some parental leave, but the parental leave is only for workers because what you're trying to do is to get both parents to work. Now you want this leave to be fairly highly compensated because that way both parents would take it, and you want the leave to be, interestingly, not too long, because you don't want parents to stay out of the labor market and stay at home with their kids for extended periods of time, because then their skills, they lose networks. When they come back into the labor market, it's hard to pick up from right where they were. Dual earner support. Second kind of support is what they call traditional family support. And here we have an idea that we should give generous cash benefits to all families with children, not just the workers. We're not trying to support workers here. We're trying to support families. And then partly because we're trying to support families with cash or tax credits. We don't have a lot of extra money left over for childcare, and we're not necessarily trying to support earners here. We're just trying to help families cover the cost of raising kids. So those are the two kinds of support: a dual earner support, a traditional family support. And so then we put these together and we get three regimes. One regime they call an earner-carer regime, and those are the countries that are doing a lot on this dual earner support dimension. A second would be traditional family regime, and this is those things I talked about on the traditional family side, where often it's one parent working, one parent not. And then a third that's low on both dimensions, which they call a market-oriented approach. So we have an earner-carer approach, a traditional approach, and a market-oriented approach. The market-oriented approach, the government is doing little on either dimension. Now, given the maps that I showed you at the beginning, you can guess where the US is, right? So the US is low on both dimensions. It's sort of the prototypical example of a market-oriented approach. Well, now I want us to think about, so if those are three basic approaches, how might child support fit into those categories? So here's, I'm working off a paper that was published this year that my co-author from Finland and a co-author from the UK and I did. And here's what we argue in that paper. So first, I want us to think about when kids live with their mother, and then how much should we expect in child support, in this case, from the father when the kids are living with their mother. Well, in the earner-carer model, the whole idea of the government here is that both parents should be working. And so if both parents are employed, you might not expect a lot of child support to go from one parent to the other. You're expecting that both parents should be able to provide for themselves and their kids. In this traditional model, though, where you often have one parent, typically husband, in the labor market, and one parent, typically mother, at home, then you need child support. And you need child support to go from the father to the mother to make up for her and the kids' need for income. Now, in a market-oriented scheme, the third kind of model here, here the government's not doing very much at all. And so we argue that then you might expect quite a bit of child support because there's no government sort of safety net that's robust to fall back on. So you'd expect parents, we expect parents to be the primary source of support. The government's in the background at the very end in a very residual way. So that's our expectations for child support obligations and how important child support should be in these three different kinds of countries. And now let's think about this new emerging form where kids spend half their time with mom and half their time with dad. So should there be child support at all? And we argue that in the earner-carer model, there probably won't be child support because now not only do we expect both parents to be workers, we're expecting them both to be carers. And so there's no reason for a financial transaction. Skipping down to the market approach, also, because there's this preference for a lack of government involvement, if the two parents have similar sorts of incomes, then you might expect no child support either, because the government's role is clearly residual at the end. But in this traditional family approach where we've got families who mostly specialize in either working or caring, even if things are split 50-50, you might still expect child support to make up for the probably over-earning of the earning specialized person. You want them to pay something to the person specializing in care. Does that make sense? So our predictions here, when mothers get custody, child support might be high for traditional and market-oriented countries and low for the earner-carer countries. When we move to the shared regime, you might expect traditional countries still to have some moderate child support, but very little support in the earner-carer and market countries. So let's see if that actually turns out to be the case. So here's what we did. So we collect vignette data. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, from expert informants in 13 different countries. And the countries, fortunately, fall into these three groups. So there are some earner-carer countries: Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. Anybody see any similarities there? Some traditional countries: Belgium, Estonia, France, and Spain. And then some market countries: Australia, New Zealand, UK, and the US. And because the US scheme is decentralized, where states are actually making decisions about how much child support is expected, we've averaged California, Illinois, Minnesota, South Carolina, and Wisconsin. Okay, I said I'd talk a little bit more about the vignette approach. Here it is. So we tell a little story. And the story has more details than this, but here's the basics. We have Peter, Paul, and Mary. So Mary and Paul are divorcing. In the original scenario, they had just one kid named Peter, but now in this scenario, they have two kids, age 7 and 10. Mary earns median female full-time earnings within that country. Paul earns median male full-time earnings within that country. So if there's some gender inequities or inequalities across countries, that's preserved here. So Mary's sort of the typical full-time worker. Paul's the typical full-time worker, but within gender. Now they get divorced. The kids in this first scenario live with Paul Friday to Sunday every other weekend. So kind of a typical divorce scenario in for much of the last, say, 50 years in the US. And then the question is, okay, in this now typical scenario, how much child support does Paul owe Mary? And the method here then is going to be pretty simple. We've got answers across the 13 countries, and we're going to just present them and see if the answer about how much child support expectations are does vary by family policy regime. Then we'll do the same thing again. We have exactly the same story, except now we're going to change number 3. And instead of the kids living with Paul Friday through Sunday every other weekend, kids are going to alternate. 1 week with Paul, 1 week with Mary, 1 week with Paul, 1 week with Mary. So this is a 50-50 custody situation. We're going to call this shared care. And the question then that we asked the country informants was, now how much, if any, does Paul owe Mary? So this is the vignette. The idea is we have a little story. We ask country experts how much, or country informants, how much child support would be required in these situations. And then we're going to see if that matches what we expect from the family policy regime. We're going to do a simple statistical test here, and ANOVA, those of you who had basic statistics might remember this, but the basic idea is just whether the variation between the 3 family types, between the countries that are earner-carer and the countries that are traditional family and the countries that are market-oriented, whether that variation across types is bigger than the variation of the countries within type. So like our Denmark and Sweden and Finland, kind of the same and different from Belgium, Estonia, Spain, who are different from the US, New Zealand, Australia? Or is there a lot of variation within these presumed family policy regimes? Here's the first answer. I'm sorry if the type is a little small. So this is a country is a bar. The height of the bar shows the child support per child that's expected. They've all been converted to US dollars. And the first group of countries there are the earner-carer countries. And the average across them is $197 a month. They're all pretty similar. Then in the middle, those four in the middle are traditional family countries. And you see that Spain in particular, and then Estonia are fairly high. So the average here is $326. And then the four market-oriented countries are on the right side, and there's the US at the end, that big bar. And so the average here is 274. So the question, do earner care countries expect less in this typical case? Well, on average, yes. But to sort of give away the point, which we'll get to later, there's a lot of variation, particularly within the traditional family model and the market-oriented model. So it doesn't fit the data as well as we thought it might. Okay, what happens when we move to shared care? I have to explain this graph. So the height of the bar shows the expectation in the last case, the mother custody case. And then we filled in how much of that is expected in this case. So the very first country on the left is Denmark. And there you see that they used to, in the last case, they expected about $190, and there's no gray at all in Denmark. So if, in this case, the kid's living every other week with mom and every other week with dad, they expect no child support. Finland, the next country there, the gray shows how much they expect. And you probably can't see those numbers, but it's about $150 a month. So the amount went down. That's the difference. That's that little white slice of the bar, but not that much. Surprisingly, Iceland, the next bar, doesn't change at all. And you see this played out then. So what you're supposed to be able to do is think about just the gray. And if you look at the gray, then the earner care countries have an average of 74. The traditional family model countries have an average of 124. And the market-oriented model countries have an average of 47. They all went down by a substantial percentage. So is the traditional family model higher than the earner care and the market-oriented? Well, yes, 124 compared to 74 and 47. Summary. In mother custody cases, do earner care countries expect less child support than the other kinds of countries? Yes, they do. Second, in shared care, do earner care and market-oriented countries expect less than in mother custody cases? Yes, they almost all went down. But when we moved to shared care, the traditional family countries also expected less. So in fact, there was as much variation within the country clusters as there was between country clusters. All right, I want to just talk a little bit about the limitations of that kind of analysis. There was just one single informant or expert within each country. They might have been wrong. We didn't try to triangulate. The vignettes, although they take a typical earner for men and women, we're not exactly sure that the typical divorcing couple, both of them have typical earnings for their gender. So the story that we told might not be that common. Third, what we're asking the informants to tell us is the rules about how much should be ordered, and it's possible that rules may not be followed. So the way policy looks in the law books and in legislation might be different from the way it looks on the ground. That's particularly true in a system that relies on the judiciary, where it's actually a judge who's signing off on the divorce decree that may or may not fit country level policy. Fourth, what we've asked for here is the amount of obligation. So how much are you supposed to pay in child support? And we know in the US that the amount of child support that people are supposed to pay is not always paid. And so we've tried to design this paper looking at expectations and obligations, but that may not result in child well-being. And then the last thing I want to say here is this is a very limited range of countries, right? These are all European or Anglo countries, all with a fairly high economic status if you look around the world, and we don't really know what this would look like somewhere else. Okay, I want to now ask you some questions to think about. What does this mean for us? So here's three policy and practice questions. So the first one, this paper is thinking about how shared care works within child support policy across countries. And this is not a paper that takes a stand, does not say how shared care should work. It says how shared care does work. So it does say how it should work according to policies, but not according to principles of social justice. So this is one piece of a policy question, but there's a whole nother range of policy questions having to do with the connection between the policies in place in a country and issues of social and economic justice. We haven't addressed those yet. Those are open issues, I think. Turns out that shared care, these kids who live half their time with mom and half their time with dad, create difficulties for policymakers, and it's not just in the realm of child support. So if you think about this, imagine kids who spend half their time with mom and half their time with dad in the US, and maybe both parents have low income and both parents are eligible for SNAP or Food Sharing Wisconsin. So both parents should be able to get some food share benefit. But whose family does that kid count in if the kid is exactly half the time with each parent? So it turns out the US hasn't thought about this question very much, and it makes a difference because the amount of food share benefits you get depends on the number of people in your family, and we don't count half people. So we have some work to do within policy to think about how policy should respond to changes in family forms. I hope that social workers are people at the table thinking about how that might work. Second area of question is one that I struggle with a lot, and that's one that I think social workers need to ask themselves and keep asking themselves. And so the question is, who's being marginalized in this process? So if you think about the history of child support policy in the US, crudely, it goes something like this. We started with this notion that there were fathers out there who weren't providing for their children, and as a result, moms and kids were economically vulnerable and at high risk of poverty, or maybe even at high risk of welfare receipt. And so what we need to do is make these dads pay. And so that was the policy regime we were in, and in fact, in some ways, are still in. But there's some changes around the edges, and now I hear a lot, and policy in some ways is beginning to change to say, well, it doesn't actually do us any good to ask for money from fathers who don't have any. So instead, we should give those fathers a pass unless they have sufficient resources for themselves and their children. Now, I understand that policy, and in fact, I've made those arguments from time to time myself. But the question that I think social workers keep needing to think about is, who's speaking for the child here? And is it really the child who's being marginalized as parents are making decisions about support and non-support? So I think social work has a particular role to play here in thinking about how policy is affecting individuals. And then the third question I want us to think about is, can we learn from other contexts? So some of my current research is trying to figure this question out. What are other places doing, and how's it working? It's one thing to argue that US policy is not being effective, is further disenfranchising or marginalizing groups. I think that's often true, but I want to push us to move on to the next question, which is, okay, so what could we be doing differently? And I encourage all of us to think about what other countries, what other places are doing and how it's working. So that's the talk that I wanted to give today. Let me just give you a couple takeaway points, and then the citation for the article that most of this is based on is on the screen. So takeaways, family policy, ways that governments approach supporting families, and in this case, particularly families with children. Countries do very different things. One model of what countries try to do divides between countries that are trying to promote both parents as earners and carers, other countries that are trying to just support families with cash, and that often reifies and has feedback effects on sort of traditional roles and might not be best, my view, for gender equality. But that's sort of a traditional family approach. And then there's the approach of the US and other countries, which is not to do very much, to let the market try to take care of this. In the talk today, I'm trying to say, well, how would child support fit into those family policy models? You saw that we think that earner carer models probably expect least in child support, and they do not expect very much. You see that we are curious about how countries' family policies handle this new emerging situation where kids spend half their time with each parent. And in almost all cases, child support goes down, but not in a predictable way, according to these family policy models. I've tried to argue that we need to pay attention to the ways that policies are affecting kids and families, and particularly the ways that they're affecting economically vulnerable or marginalized families. Thank you very much. I can take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Dan. I was checking to see if we have any students on. I don't see any students on. Is it okay if students, if maybe they watch this at a later time, have questions, if they reach out to you directly?
Of course. And so
Perfect.
my email is on the web, and that's probably the best way to reach me.
Perfect. All right, so to wrap up today's presentation, I want to say a gracious thank you to Dan for taking his time on a Saturday to come and give this presentation. We really appreciate you having and being a part of our Lunch and Learn series. I hope everyone who watches this video finds it interesting and learns something from your presentation today. All right, I think that concludes our presentation. I'm going to pause the recording.